So picking up from where I left off in my third video, this fourth video then gets back to the idea of languages tending to use specific arrangements of constituents in their most, frequent, canonical, unmarked sentences. So this is what the next slide says. Languages tend to place modifying elements, in this case, either consistently before or consistently after modified elements or heads. So this idea of consistent characteristic is what I mean when I say canonical. Canonical written like this, or unmarked, right? Canonical or unmarked sentences, the ones that are the simplest, the most frequent, right? The ones that are the most consistent in the patterns that can be arrived at by looking at the sentences that are produced in a given language. All right, when it comes to position of modifiers or adjectives, in this case, in a noun phrase, in English, the most unmarked position for an adjective will be the attributive position, the prenominal position, right? Attributive, when it means position, is to be equated with prenominal. And postpositive or post-nominal, nomino, in Spanish. Okay? Let's not concentrate on this. Okay, so this I tackled before, and then to conclude, the last slides in my presentation will be, a form of revision of what the main ideas that I want to highlight with this presentation are. So the generative enterprise revisited, I've taken this material from my classes at the University of Pittsburgh in the United States, 2008, and my professor was Professor Masullo. So the knowledge that we have on language is then an internalist approach to language, the one that Chomsky gave way to, originated, and he then understands that language is a cognitive capacity that we have as human beings. That linguistic competence comes before language performance or language use. So this knowledge of a language is prior to putting the language to use. That when it comes to children's acquisition of a language under normal circumstances, it happens through socialization, through children being exposed to the language. And it just so happens that children all over the world are able to pick up their language, the language that they were born into, that they are surrounded by. The performance dimension gives way to us posing the question, what makes us speak or not? The question of appropriateness, us judging, something to be appropriate or not. And then the fact that there is a neurobiological basis of language. That's why we have this mentalist, internalist approach to language. And the mind is then the seat of language, is where language is located in a specific module. He postulates that language is to be found in a specific module, in a specific area of the brain, and that this is where our linguistic, ability is to be physically found, if we want to do so, in. So input, he acknowledges Chomsky, this is a photo of Noam Chomsky, is vital, so this exposure that Hageman speaks of, but still is secondary in his view. He focuses more on competence, not on performance. Competence, on this knowledge that he assumes all native speakers of languages have, this set of rules and principles that they must know so as for them to end up being fluent users of whatever language we consider. This is an innate capacity for language. We're born with capacities, for example, anatomical, physiological. So then, if we're born with anatomical and physiological characteristics, this is yet another characteristic that defines human beings, this capacity for language. He says that we have cognition. This is one of the major, differentiating features of human beings with respect to other species. We have not major differences across humans. We all do have it under normal circumstances if we're born without, mental cognitive problems. In general, everybody is capable of learning a language, and also perception, a different, ability, is universal. It's a shared ability across humans. So, revision again of material presented before. Language is part of our genetic endowment. There is this matrix that we're born with, which is activated by the environment. It activates the structuring that we will associate with Spanish or English or Chinese or the language that we're born into. In what aspects nature is important, right? In what aspects nurture is important, rather philosophical questions. What is the nature of language knowledge? Nature is important in the sense of, us having this genetic endowment, genetic predisposition for language, but that cannot be activated by a specific linguistic natural environment, right? And nurture in the sense of, us having the basic needs covered so that we can, develop the potential that we're born that we're born with. Without this nurturing environment, who can actually develop their potential, actualize their potential. Competence, unconscious knowledge of the grammar of our language. Everybody has intuitions about what is well formed or not. To cognize is a term coined by Chomsky, to know unconsciously whether something is well formed or not. And once we have this knowledge, we recycle it. We apply it whenever we need to apply it and decide that a sentence is part of Spanish or not. Spanish or any language for that matter. So certain aspects of language, it is an autonomous module. It is separated from other, cognitive modules. This is his postulate that there is this modular, understanding of language, and that language belongs to one of the modules that make up our, cognitive abilities as human beings. That a language obeys its own grammar, it obeys its own laws and principles. Depending on the specific language that we are considering, we will be born with the general principles that we all share, but then we'll end up, setting the values for the, parameters that are associated with the principles in a specific manner in accordance with what happens in the environment that we are speakers of. A principle is an overarching, type of, mechanism. A rule is to be understood as something more specific, more language specific. Example of the projection principle. This is also to do with the exemplification of principle types. It is a UG principle suggested in earlier work by Chomsky, which required that the properties of lexical items should remain constant throughout the derivation. The derivation here is a technical term, and it points to, you know, these tree-like analyses that we can make of sentences that you may be doing or will be doing in Linguistics 1. But the idea to be understood is what Cook explains on pages 28 and 29 and pertains to the content, the lexical content of items. For example, the content of put. The very meaning of put entails that an object accompany it and that a locative also accompany it for it to be part of a grammatical structure. So we cannot just have John put and make sense. And what is it that stops us from making sense? The fact that we are not including in the sentence parts that are required by the very semantics of the verb put in this case. We cannot stop at put and leave, those words out, for put requires that the object be specified and that the locative be specified as well. So we've got to say that we, or he, in this case, John, put something, that is to say, the book, somewhere on the table. So the obligatoriness of these two constituents, the book and on the table, springs from the content, the semantic requirement that put specifies. Right? In Cook's material, you have at the end of 28 the following information. The speaker knows many other aspects of language as well as principles and parameters. Knowledge of vocabulary is especially important to principles and parameters theory. A person who knows the verb faint knows not only its meaning, but also how it is used in sentences, in the same way that a person who knows the meaning of put knows how to use it in grammatical structures in English. So, faint usually has an animate subject in front of it, but no grammatical object after it, different from put in this case. So we can have Peter fainted. I'm reading off Cook's page 28 and now Cook's page 29 at the beginning. But of course we cannot have the rock fainted, nor can we have Peter fainted Mary. For faint comes with specific, indications as to how it can be used grammatically in English. So knowledge of words is closely tied in to the syntax. The native speaker has learned how words behave in sentences as well as what they mean. So not only do we have to know how to arrange constituents in a sentence so that we can make an English sentence or a Spanish sentence, but also what constituents in a sentence are obligatory given, for example, key elements in a sentence such as verbs. The verb put is different in its nature from the verb faint. You're used to calling the verb put a transitive verb, right? In this case, if we want to be more specific, we can call it a complex transitive verb because not only does it require an object that makes it transitive, but also a locative, the indication of a place, an adverbial that makes it a complex transitive verb. In contrast, faint is an intransitive verb. The only requisite that faint so to speak, comes with is that it be accompanied by a subject, but a specific type of subject. It cannot be an inanimate subject, but rather an animate one. So then, knowledge of a language is not only about knowing the rules and the principles that allow us to make sentences, to arrange sentences in the way the language permits, but also knowing what the, lexical items, the lexicon, the vocabulary that the language has, and the specifications that the vocabulary also must have met in order for this vocabulary to be used grammatically, that is to say, to be part of possible sentences in the given language.